you reach out for it, yeah. That'd be great.
Yeah, and we'll say that in the intro.
Yeah.
Although we didn't synchronize that with Kent, so we should do that even though it's time to start. So we'll start, and I'll interrupt Kent. Kent, let's begin. Kent? Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking you were presenting. It is time to start the session. I am Lou Berger. Kent Watson is my co-chair. He is remote. And so you'll see a little bit more exposed to how we work things because we're not sitting next to each other. You'll notice that we have some changes in our working group structure or management. The first is Joel Jegley has moved on as chair. We really appreciate his service to the group. Recognize that. Thank him. And equally, we appreciate Jason, who's sitting here with me, who's volunteered to act as our secretary and is already helping out. Yeah, so thanks to both of you. Really appreciate it. With that, next slide. So this is our note well. We're the second day of the IETF. Maybe you're familiar with it. Hopefully you are. If you're not, take a look at the link on the bottom or go to the IETF page and look at, make sure you're familiar with this. It governs how we operate and contribute at the IETF, and basically everything you say here or on the list becomes part of our permanent record and is a formal contribution to the group. Next. We also would like to remind everyone that we have a code of conduct that governs how we interact with each other, and basically be respectful, be professional. It's okay to have good technical discussion, but remember that to work in an appropriate way with your peers. And there's a BCP on that, of course. Next. For those that are in person, we ask you two things, and they're both highlighted on the slides on the left, the screen on the left. First, please scan in. That covers Blue Sheet. It also allows you to participate in any polling that we do, and we will be doing that. We're not doing hums or hands because we want to be fair to those who are online, and so we'll be using the tool. So it's very important that you scan in. The other is the policy of the IETF and of this meeting is you are to wear a mask if you are not at the front speaking. So we remind you that you are asked to wear a mask fully and properly, and if you need a mask, they're at the front. For those of you that are remote, you figured out where you are because you're online, so that's great. The only other thing is please keep yourself muted if you are not speaking. Next. We will be using the Meet Echo for queue control, both remote and local. That's to be equitable to those who are remote. We also ask that you join us for joint minute taking. The link is in the Meet Echo chat. It's also on every one of our materials pages. It really helps to make sure that your comments are appropriately captured. So if you make a comment, please go take a look at the notes and make sure we've got what you meant down. Next. We have some good discussion time available to us today on the hot topic that we've been working on for a while on versioning. That's the bulk. That's the biggest session, and there's there's actually going to be 3 different speakers during that slot. We are going to move that a little bit later in the session because our AD has to step out for about 10-15 minutes. So when he goes, we're going to wait for him to come back to hit that very important discussion. So Shifang and Oscar, I don't know if you're both in the room. Hopefully you're both in the room. See Oscar? Ah, perfect. Thank you. So you might go a little early. So just be prepared. Thank you. Thank you for that. Next. So where do we stand on documents? I'm not sure I want to read through all of these. We have, I'll highlight the post last call ones. The first one is actually on the agenda, which is great to see. It had been stuck for a little while, so that's awesome. We need to still work out on how to get the second one unstuck. And I don't know if you want to say anything, Rob, or not. Don't if you think it's good.
So, Rob Wilton, so I'm to blame for these, and I'd like to thank both Scott and Dom for sort of helping out pick up, and they'll edit. But I think the plan is to edit both of these documents, and the plan is to try and do the first one first, and then once that one's out of the way, work with law school, then the second one will go through. So I think there is a plan. It's just sort of getting that together. So it's still a strong desire to get these done.
Okay, great. That's awesome. The next document we're going to talk about a little bit more, I believe, on the next slide, if I remember the slides right. And the other two we've been, we're actually going to, are on the agenda also. So we're not going to have to go with that. And so on the syslog model, there's been an update, and the question to the authors are what's left?
Hi, Joe Clark, Cisco. Good to see you there, Jason. And thanks, Joel. What's left? So we think just open up a new last call. We know there's some pending things to do, but they're minor, and we're just holding off to get some last call comments. So I thought, Kent, you were going to open this up. I don't think there's anything pending on Mahesh or my side, but that's where we stand right now.
Right.
Kansas Shepherd. Oops, sorry,
Go
just
ahead.
quickly, Joe. I saw a comment from Rashad regarding the feasibility of the solution. Was there any thoughts to what we should do with that comment?
Oh man, I need more coffee. We were talking about bringing in more of the kind of the overall TCP structure, or like bringing in things like proxy. The authors spoke. The consensus seemed to be that might be overkill for what we want to do with syslog. There didn't seem to be need for that, but that's something I think to bring up in the last call. What does the working group think? As it stands right now, we weren't going to make that change yet. We were just going to leave things where they were, where we just have a destination and a port.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great, thank you. Similarly, we'd like to ask if there's any authors online or in the room to give us a update on node tags and answer what they think is left.
Yeah, for this one, actually,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your name and I can't hear you very well either.
This is Qingwu, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, for node tag, actually, we already have working group last call. I think we addressed all the comments from the issue raised by the Yugen. Actually, we also think it's nothing left. We want to move forward, but for the change we proposed, actually, maybe we need to solicit some feedback from Yugen. Again, haven't got feedback yet. Yeah, but from our side, I think is ready to move forward.
All right, thank you very much. All right, let's move on. Kent, do you want to speak to this or you want me to?
You're in the room, but we worked on the slide together. Please go ahead.
Okay, that's all right. So there is a open issue on the 6991 BIS. The Kent sent mail on this. You can go look at the link archive. That's a little hard to type in. I believe that was in September. Basically, there were a few points open. We think this slide captures what's left, and we have a proposal on how to move forward. And not if we don't hear objections, our intent is to move forward. So now's your opportunity to object if you have an issue with what's on the slides. The first is on the with regard to the address no zone discussion. We're going to add. I'm not sure why there's a question mark there on that number 2. We're going to add an IP address with a zone and deprecate IP address. So right now, IP address has a zone in it that's caused huge amounts of confusion. We think the right answer is that one should go away, and it should be replaced with zone.
Yeah, with a name that's sorry, with a name
Go
that's
ahead.
more explicit. With a name that's more explicit. So
Yes.
instead of being implicit, it becomes explicit, but we deprecate the legacy one, so it's not. We don't break backwards compatibility.
Similarly, we would like to do the same thing with date and time. So we have some consistency there between the different types. And there was a discussion about a language tag, and the conclusion was there wasn't really consensus in the working group. And because there's no consensus, we think we're going to leave. We recommend leaving it as is. If you disagree or have any objections, we would love to hear it now, but we'd also like to hear it on the list. So, you know, people may not have had time today to think about it and react. You don't have to react right now, but if you have a reaction, please feel free to join the queue. That's the type of reaction we like, because we're going to keep moving forward with this, and we'll coordinate with Jorgen to get an update. Kent, do you want to say anything else before we move on? Oh, great.
No, that's great. Well, I mean, other than, I mean, you said that give people time to think about it, but as you mentioned, that I did send an email on September 13th, so it's been out there, I think, now for a couple months, and plenty of time for people to think about it. Yes, let's move on to the next slide.
So we had an incoming liaison from ORAN. We actually talked about it a little bit at the last meeting, and then we never completed the action on it. And so there was a proposal sent to the list. I think, Jason, didn't you send it or you commented on it? But we're going to continue to work to get this out, to get a response out. And if you'd like to contribute to it, feel free to send a message to the list or to the chairs alias. Next.
Join the queue. Jason started, I could just comment on that. So the authors group is actively discussing what we think is reasonable timelines for that. So we are working to try to figure out an estimate on that.
This is our usual slide about, you know, we've been working remote for quite a while. We continue to do that. We have resources available, virtual meetings. WebEx is open informal meetings. Just want everyone to be aware that those continue to go on. And if you would like to participate, you're always welcome. And if you have a topic that you would like to start a new discussion on, that's all. The working group resources are available to you. Just contact the chairs alias, and one of us will help you out. And with that, I think I've hit the last slide. Next. Yes. And so we're going to move on to Scott Mansfield.
Are we doing that now, or is Rob still in the room?
No, we're going to Scott, and
Okay.
then we're going to skip versioning.
Okay. And Scott, I passed you slide control.
Okay, now I just have to figure out how to do that.
Right keypad button.
Oh, okay. Well, that's. Thanks very much. I assume that you can hear me because I'm mumbling. So thank you very much for providing me with a few minutes of agenda time for this topic. Hopefully it will be very quick. This is about both of the drafts, the interface extensions Yang and the sub-interface VLAN Yang. So if I click this button, I go to the next slide. Look at that. So both of these drafts expired in January of 2021, and I provided the links to the data tracker. On the previous page was the links to the GitHub. These are the links to the expired drafts. And then so last IETF, there was a desire to progress these. So Rob talked to Don and I about taking this up. So what we've done so far is we've progressed the work on the common interface extension Yang. There's a few things that I need support on. One is I need to hear from the existing authors, and Rob has replied to an email on this already, but I would like to contact the existing authors that are on the draft and find out if they want to remain on the draft. And then Don and I would be editors because we didn't really create the content necessarily. We're just modifying it. And then I also need to talk to someone about how we can get access to the repository. And the C Camp working group, I'm using GitHub and I can put things directly in, but I don't have access to do that to these to the GitHub for these NetMod drafts. So anyone that has an idea how to do that, please contact.
I'll take care of it and hopefully have it done before you're done speaking.
Oh, excellent. That would be fabulous. And so the next thing is they're in the common interface extension draft. We're trying to use Git the way it was meant to be used. So we have issues written down. There are 6 open issues. I've put them all here and provided notes on the ones that we've accepted, the ones we haven't accepted. I have created a new draft, but it's in my local clone. And once I have access, I can push it up and then I can create a new version of that draft and send it out. And so please take a look at, if you're interested in this draft, please take a look at the resolutions here. Once I get it pushed up, you'll be able to read the draft and see the changes that we've made. There's a couple of things here that there's like, we need some more description on something. So looking for the experts to provide a little more input on that. Next slide is on the sub interface VLAN. We have, I think there's also 6 issues on this one. We haven't progressed any work on that. I want to finish the work, like Rob said, finish the work on the one and then contact the authors and get permission. So that's the same thing for that draft as well. So our plan is to progress the drafts, communicate with the authors, and hopefully have great news to report in IETF 116. That's all I had. Thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you. Please type at me your GitHub ID and I'll take care of that administrative action. With that, we are going to skip over versioning. And Shifan, I think you are going to be next. So Kent, number 4, perfect. And if I mispronounced your name, I apologize.
So hello, everyone. This is Chu Fang from Huawei. And this presentation is about the Yang extension and mandate annotation for immutable flag. So next slide, please. So to give a very brief recap, the use cases we are focusing on this work is about there are 2 kinds of use cases. The first one that there are some config true data nodes which are immutable. When I say immutable, I mean that is not allowed to be created, deleted, or updated, and is independent of how it's instantiated. And the second use case is that when some data nodes they exist in multiple instances in the data tree, for example, is a list or leaf list data node, while some of their instances are read-only while others are not. So our objective is really about the documentation or visibility. So we would like to define a standard mechanism to allow the server to document their existing immutable configuration data, so provide more visibility about their immutability characteristic. But we need to emphasize that this work doesn't mean that we are encouraging such adding the immutable flag behavior for server implementation. So next slide, please. Yeah, before we are trying to get into the solution, and I would like to mention that there is a definition about the immutable. Here, when I say immutable, we mean that there is a schema or instance node property indicating that the configuration data is not allowed to be created, deleted, or updated. I know that it might be a little different from our common understanding of this immutable word. So the question for the working group is that, can we do better about this terminology? So the solution, we have defined an immutable Young extension and immutable metadata notation. And for the Young extension, there is an argument statement named exceptions, which is defined to indicate that specific operations are permitted. And the operations, create, update, and delete. For example, if a configuration data, it can only be created and deleted, and modification is not allowed. So you can say that immutable and create and delete. And for the immutable metadata annotation, currently we are defining this annotation as a type of Boolean, and it indicates that once a particular instance data node is created, then the client cannot update or delete it. And we have restricted that this annotation is only applied to the list or leaf list entries, for instance, inside a particular entries. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so about the document updates, according to the comments we received in last IETF meeting, so we had made several updates. For example, we refresh the document and avoid using some statement like server must reject, which seems like we are adding some more restrictions, just trying to clarify that this document aims to provide more visibility into their server existing immutable behavior. And the second one is that clarifying explicitly in the draft that the deletion to an immutable node in running, which is instantiated in system and copied into running, should always be allowed, because from the device perspective, even it is deleted from running and can still present it in system and present it in operation or it is in use. So there's no way to actually delete the configuration in system. So that's okay for a client to delete that in running. And we also clarify that write access restriction due to the general Young rules has no need to be marked as immutable. For example, a key leaf in a list, you cannot modify it or delete it if the instance, once the instance is created, but there's no need to remark as immutable. And also clarify that how the immutable flag interacts with the NAC mechanism. So if a specified data node, for instance, is marked as immutable, we think that NAC cannot override it to create the delete or update access. Yeah. So next slide, please. Yeah, and another update is that we have added a new section to discuss the inheritance of immutability. So the draft just said that unless otherwise specified, so the immutability in the hierarchy just is inherited downwards towards the leaf or leaf list terminal nodes. But you need to mention that if a node has a child element, then the non-modification to that node just means that it's any child elements is not allowed to be created, updated, or deleted. However, there might be a desire to override the immutability of a particular descendant node. So we do allow it to be overridden if a container node would have a different immutability with its ancestor node. So for example, it's a list definition and with an immutable Young extension, which means that this list instance is not allowed to be created, updated, or deleted by the client, but there is a leaf named port number. It has the immutable with the exceptions for create, update, and deleted. So in this case, the port number instance is allowed to be created, updated, or deleted in the list entry. So this is about the override. Okay, Jason in the queue.
Hi, yeah. Just a question: if it's inherited, is the annotation when you fetch the data, is the annotation then not the extension, but the annotation on the data, is it inherited as well? Would it only be shown at the top, or is it would be shown for every sub-element?
Yeah, currently we are thinking that these inheritance are only applied to the Young extension node defined in the Young module, and because it might be a too strict way if we just define it as a metadata annotation, and there's no way to override the immutability of its descendant node. So right now we are only considering it applied to the Young extension about this inheritance.
Sorry, I wasn't talking about the override. It was more if an object in the schema, if at the list entry it's immutable, and you read the data, are you going to see the annotation against every leaf in the list, or just when you read the data, are you going to see the annotation against every item in the list, every leaf in the list, or just against the list entry at the top?
List entry at the top.
Just the top?
Yeah. Yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, so for the next step of this work, the authors think that this work has been cooked for a little while, and there is a real world and common issues about this work. So we'd like to request to the working group for adoption. Okay. So next slide, please.
Lindblad is in the queue. Go ahead, Jan.
Thank you. But maybe I should wait to the end. I thought it was getting close to it. I'll wait for a minute.
Yeah, I think this is my last real work.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, it's always nice to see that we are documenting the behavior of servers and all that. So that's, I mean, the basic stance here. This is not ideal, but we want to describe to the world how things work. That's good. But I have concerns that this is getting closer to the SNMP world where there are lots of special rules and tricks and stuff. You have to, I mean, you can't write an SNMP client that can manage a device automatically. You have to have hand-coded sort of SNMP-like scripts that knows about all the restrictions and constraints and the impossibilities. So, okay, immutable, I see that's fine. But when you say that something might be possible to create but not delete, or delete but not create, I don't believe you. There is no such thing that can, if you create it, it can never be deleted. It's just that you have to jump through some other hoops. Oh, in that case, you have to delete the entire list, or you have to do something else to actually get back to the factory state. But you can, if you have created something, you can in fact delete it in some way, not just the most direct way. So if we are to have annotations like this in the model to say that, oh, this one cannot be deleted, we have to tell the controller, so what do I need to do in order to actually delete it? And should I go to the top level list, or should I go to factory reset? What is it I need to do? Because if we are leaving this as a sort of English description somewhere, I don't think we are talking about netconf anymore. Then we are talking about SNMP or nothing else. So I want the interface to be clear. How does the manager get from one configuration state to another in every case? I mean, there needs to be a programmatic way to figure it out.
Okay.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. Thank you. So Balash, do you want to?
I have one smart more.
Sorry,
okay, so you said something was immutable, but okay, let's say if somebody wants to do a replace of the entire data store, is that valid?
Sorry, pardon?
if you do a replace for the entire data store, including those things that were immutable, can I do that?
Yeah, you can read it. It's just about the.
So as you can configure things, create things as long as they are the same as they were always there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. First of all, I think by documenting this existing behavior, that's what allows systems to work in a model-driven way instead of doing separate scripts and separate hoops for every special bit of data. The other thing is also as a participant in 3GPP SA5, which has, I don't know, some 100 or around 100 YAG models now. This is existing behavior for the last, I don't know, 20 years. Their question is about this, can we document this in a standard way or do we have to do it in a 3GPP way? So there are very strong use cases for this already. Back to your question, it is stated in the draft that if you already have a value, immutable, unchangeable value, let's say 5, you can set it to 5 again. Thank you.
Thank you.
While Rob is coming up, I'm going to start a poll on adoption. And we actually have 3 states here. You can raise your hand, you can answer and lower your hand, or you can not answer. And so we've asked, so if you raise your hand, you think it means it's time to adopt. You do not raise your hand, it means you don't. If you don't participate, you don't have an opinion. So please go online and start thinking about your response. Rob, please.
So Rob Watson, Cisco, speaking as a participant, so I'm concerned with this same sort of concern that Jan has in terms of, I wonder this sort of fundamentally changing the contract between a client and a device in terms of what you're allowed to configure and the fact you're controlling that configuration. At the same time, I also understand where Balázs is coming from, saying real systems are doing this today, they're already blocking this configuration. So in some senses, pretending it's not happening is also not putting us in a better place. So I don't know how you really balance those two things to say this is like maybe documentation, but perhaps it's a matter of saying in the draft that this is not a recommended way of managing the configuration. It's like we don't recommend this, but if you are doing this, this is the way you document it. I don't know. I'm conflicted on this one.
Andy, please go ahead.
I was probably the only one who said not to adopt, but I think this is just a special case of a deviation, really, and it's about the implementation, so it's appropriate to use a deviation. I don't see where a standard module or any kind of published module would have this extension in it to restrict it this way. I guess it also could be done with NACM, just more NACM rules, but it has some uses, I agree, but it's also got some issues that were just mentioned that I also agree with. So that's it.
Okay, thanks, Andy. I'll note that Kent has had a supporting comment to Balázs in the chat.
Okay, Balázs Lengyel. I don't think NACM is the good place for this. First of all, NACM can be switched off. This is more a property of the data model, what you can and cannot do with this. NACM is about allowing things in some cases, not allowing it in other cases. But also NACM can be switched off. So and I know you say that you can't imagine published models. There are published models in 3GPP, but I think in other places, it's not whether we imagine it or not, they exist already, not one, but many.
Okay, thank you. Andy, are you still in queue? I'm going to remove you from the queue. If you want to come back in, just read.
Oh, I think I should have just clicked it off. Sorry.
So Rob Wilson, Cisco. So just think about this a little bit more. I know in OpenConfig at the moment, they're having a suggestion that devices don't validate leaf refs, for example. So they're sort of changing the behavior of Yang in a slightly different way to say it's a slightly different variation of Yang. And it feels the same thing sort of happening with this. Is it's like another variation of network management or Yang, and it's changing from where we are to different variants. And I wonder whether that helps or hinders standardization.
So I'll definitely have to speak with Kent offline. We usually like whisper things up here, but we can't. It's a little difficult. My read, and again, I haven't consulted with Kent on this, is that it's pretty split. You know, you have people that are interested, but not a lot more than think that this isn't ready. Yeah. Based on the comments, perhaps you could put more in the draft about what is not possible, what you can do with existing mechanisms, and why you think a new mechanism is needed. And that might help those who've said no to understand why you think we have to do an extension.
Okay.
Or addition, sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, so we were going to do versioning, but I see Rob is now leaving the room. So we're not going to do versioning. Sorry about that. Instead, we're going to go on to Oscar. I think Oscar is still here. Now he's stepped out for a moment. So we're going to try to go on to the second access control, Chin Wu. So we're really going out of order here. Thank you for everyone's flexibility. We'll give a moment. We're going to move on to the draft Ma. Yeah, you got it. Thanks, Ken.
Morning, everyone. My name is Qin Wu. So I want to introduce this idea, the policy-based network access control. So this is OPS-AWT 00 version draft. The reason we come here because the basic ACL model is developed in NetMod working group. We also have ACL extension proposed by Oscar and Amanda. So we want to solicit feedback for this one. Yeah, next. So what is the problem statement? Actually, usually in the enterprise or campus network scenarios, we actually use access control list to provide network access control, especially for the fixed device user. And but sometimes this kind of ACL actually has some limitation. It is usually IP address based network access control or MAC address based access control. So for some mobile device user, they may move from one location to another location. So use ACL actually has its limitation. In some other scenario, actually, we really want to install more flexible security policy. Actually, one example, we have the attribute-based access control. So we really want to apply the access control policy to a set of the user under different circumstances. It could be based on user location or user role, or it could be based on the time of day or type of the network device to be used. Next. So we really want to solve this limitation of the network access control. So what do we propose actually to provide more fine granularity access control policy based on the user group identity. So here we give some example. You may need to restrict some of user or a group of user in specific department, for example, financial department, to restrict access to the service or resource for a specific time period. So you can, you need to design the access control policy to, to meet these requirements. So the user group here could be the, a set of group of user from financial department or from R&D department. Actually, they will represent a connective identity of the group of user. So this user can, have commonly they can access the network or consume specific network service or resource. Next. So here is our model design overview. Actually, you can see actually we really extend the ACL-based model and to introduce additional attribute. You can see the red dot rectangle diagram, and we can support actually 4 types of access control. For example, we can provide user group to user group access, or we can provide access from one source IP address prefix to the destination IP prefix address. We also can support user group to IP prefix access, or the other way around, IP prefix to the user group access. So we give the example of the user group based ACL example. You can see, we allow, different set of group of users. For example, from sale group, they can, communicate with the financial group in the destination user group. And in addition, we actually can restrict a set of users for specific time period. So we introduce time range type. We can support a periodic range or absolute range. So you can limit a group of users, for a specific time period in the working day. So Joe Clark, comments?
Thanks, Chen. You submitted this to OPSOG, and I was looking at it then, and the biggest question I have is, what is a user group? So you have a string, user group name, and I was just scratching my head. How does this resolve? Like what do I do with this? I mean, conceptually, I get it. Cisco is not allowed to talk to Huawei, let's say, as an example of user groups. But how does that actually resolve to something that the network understands?
Yeah,
there didn't seem to be a lot of prescription in there around that.
I actually have a slide after this one, actually, to explain. We really want to establish the mapping between the group ID with the IP address. So you use this mapping, so you can install this policy. So these need to translate like a user group ID into a set of the IP address or prefix.
But shouldn't there be more structure around the user group, like keying and like it's a string, which feels to me kind of arbitrary? Shouldn't there be some more referential mapping to really understand that this user group means something? Maybe I just need to see more implementation on, but that was a little of my confusion. It just seemed kind of arbitrary, and it was tough to really wrap my head around how I would actually implement this.
Yeah, I think one of the requirements from the ACL extension job, they really want to, for ACL, not tied to a specific interface of the device. So they want to apply to a set of the device. So this extension really target to solve this. So I also have a next slide to explain how it works.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, move to the next. So this is actually provide how we resolve these. Actually, this kind of ACL seems not it's kind of different from the ACL base model. Actually, you introduce this kind of group ID. So we really want to establish the mapping between the group ID and IP address. So how we can do this? Actually, for user, it can be the fixed device user, can be mobile device user. So during the network access, actually, you need to involve some AAA mechanism to provide network access authorization. After authorization, you can establish the mapping between the group ID and the IP address. So with this mapping, you can really control provide restrict access to the mobile user or maybe BYOD device user. So here we just show you example of this the mapping table, what the mapping table look like. You can see we have the group ID, or we have IP address, and then we also have added some other attributes. So these are really targeted to the attribute-based access control. So you can provide more fine granularity network access control for the user. So we actually have two use cases. In the left, actually, we assume actually, policy enforcement point actually will co-locate with AAA device in the network node actually. So you can easily to establish this kind of mapping when you pass through this kind of network access authorization. But for second one, you may separate a policy enforcement point from the AAA client. The AAA client can be in the network node, so the AAA client can establish such kind of mapping. They can export this kind of mapping to the controller, or controller can retrieve this kind of mapping from AAA server from some kind of repository. So the policy enforcement point can grab the mapping from the controller, so you can easily to pass or interpret this kind of network access policy. So this is a basic idea we show high level. For more detail, you can see the draft. So I'm not sure I answered Joe Clark's question.
Kinda. I'll dig a little deeper. It seems like, okay, so I log in, and at the time the device would resolve my user ID to a AAA group ID, and then I still, where does my IP come from? Because I can't imagine that every packet I generate is going to do that whole dance. So it's on like flow establishment, you resolve to my IP, and then the ACL works at that level?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Usually in the enterprise network or campus network scenario, you may have policy server. You may actually already have do some planning actually to, you have financial department, you have R&D department, and these need to, set a specific rules. So they can actually establish this kind of policy and install in the policy server, or can be co-located with the AAA server. So some other scenario actually, maybe for the BYOD user, this kind of device, unknown to the network actually, but you can have this kind of pre-configured the access control rules. You can, restrict the access to this unknown device. This may be attack, So this is the idea we have.
Okay, I'll read more before tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Just as a heads up, we are over time, but we have a little slop in the schedule. So I've given you until 2.5 more minutes, but then we really need to move on after that.
Okay,
Bill?
thank you. Bill?
Hi, Bill Fenner, Arista Networks. Can you go back to slide 4? I want to comment on the periodic time. This is a very simplistic view of time. You might want to look at the work that the calendaring working group has done on repeating rules. They're recurrence rules, they're called. And they can express all sorts of things like the first Tuesday of every month, etc. And once you give something like this, people are going to want something like that. So look into what the iCalendar work has done on recurrence rules.
Okay, thank you. Maybe send a link to us, we can see.
Thank you.
I'm done.
Oh, that's it? Okay, so last slide.
Yeah.
So we note that this is listed as an ops area working group document. So thank you for letting us know about it. And we'll look for the work to proceed there, unless the working group chairs, like Joe, who may or may not be listening, decide that they want to send it back here. But until it's sent back here, the general rule is you come to NetMod only when there's no other working group to work on the end.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to do the other ACL document. Hello, Oscar. Good to see you.
Apologies for before.
No worries.
I had to present them.
No worries. We have a lot of juggling of conflicting working groups, which is why we're shifting our schedule.
Okay, this is Oscar Gonzalez from Telefónica. So I'm going to present you today the extensions to the access control list and models. So next slide. So just first a little bit of context reminder. So we presented a few IETFs ago some extensions to the model. So just to recap, the RFC 8519 defines the access control list junk model. So there you can configure which is the forwarding behavior of the device and define entries, matches, and actions. Okay. So in some, I think 3 IETFs ago, we presented which were the problems that we detected. So it was based on operational experiences of putting ACLs in production and was used in our network. And there we wanted to see what was the best approach, if we have a new version of the ACL model or do augmentations on existing models, okay? And try to remain the other one untouched. So we worked in, we picked an option, go to the slide. Yeah, so we picked a choice to move forwards. So we can, the feedback was, okay, do some junk code and present it and see how we're going. And we started working with the augmentation, so don't touch existing RFC and just work on that. So here, these were all the problems were analyzed, and here we are going to go one by one of those that are covered by the current proposal. Okay, so we didn't cover 100% of them in this draft. Okay. Let's go to the next slide and then we can start. So first of all, there was one problem that we detected in terms of manageability of the access control list matches. We required, in many cases, match against some set of prefixes or set of ports. Okay, so in current model you could not add those lists. Okay, so the idea is to maintain these sets. Is the same thing that you have in the routing. Okay, so in the routing policies you already have a list of prefix ranges. And here, the idea is that in this model, we also have prefix sets, protocol sets, port number sets, ICMP sets, and well, these are the sets that we came upon, but you could have more. So we proposed to have at the top level of the ACL, have a placeholder, defined set, to there list all or create and manage all these sets. So then these sets can be reused across multiple ACLs. Also, multiple entries. So the good thing there is that they can be managed separately. So for us, in our case in Telefonica, we have our security department that just updates these prefix lists, for example, and they update it periodically or daily, and is a complete separate structure to handle. So here, this is the augmentation proposed. Okay, so next slide. So here we can show how the full tree would look like. So we have the based on the feedback that we had, separated IPv4 and IPv3 and IPv6 prefixes. So they are just plain lists, ports, protocols, and ICMP-based filters. Okay, so with all of the port sets are reusable for both TCP and UDP, and any protocol that would use ports. And we could also consider other ports. For example, we could also consider matching MPLS labels, for example. That is also one. There are at least some hardware that is able to do the matching against MPLS labels. So you could also create those sets. Okay. So next slide, please.
Full participants in the queue. Jason, please.
Yeah.
Unless he wants to take it at the end. Do you want to take it at the end?
No, we can.
Okay.
You can.
Do you mind going back one slide, please? Jason Stern. On the first augmentation, from what it's showing there, it looks like it's inside the ACL list. So are these only intended to be shared within rules of one ACL? Or is this supposed to be shared across different ACLs?
It is at the top level of ACLs. Okay, so it's meant to be shared across all ACLs that you define. Okay, so it's
okay. I think maybe it should be at the container then, not inside the list. We can take that detail offline.
One of the precisely one of the questions that we have at the end is where is the best place to position the defined sets, or even we have the question at the end, even if if we put it at a completely new container outside ACL. Okay, so this is an open question because
I
it has
like it in
implications.
ACLs. I think maybe you meant to put it in the ACLs container, but we can talk more detail after. Okay.
Okay,
And Mahesh?
Yep.
So, Mahesh, Arcus Networks. So I was actually going to wait for my question till after it was done with the presentation.
You can wait till the end. There's no problem.
Right, but to Jason's comment, I do agree with him that I think if you're going to add those defined sets, you want to do it inside the ACL's container.
Okay. So a couple of slides more. Yeah, so then another of the problems that we had is the handling of TCP flags. Right now, you could define just one bit and match against that bit. So the proposal here is to add the capability to define a bit mask and an operation over that bit mask. Then you are way more flexible and you can support all the BGP flow spec matching operations. Okay, so I think it is good to be consistent across IETF technologies. So here is the example of how it would look like. So next slide, please. Another thing is we needed a better way to handle fragments. Okay, so this is why we defined a fragment container for both IPv4 and IPv6. And to be able to match, for example, if there is a fragment, or if it's the first fragment, it is the last fragment. So, for example, you could create a rule to discard all incoming fragments. Okay, so that is also a common operation. So, next one, please. Another thing is that in current ACLs, oracles, you had the accept, drop, and reject actions. Okay, so you accept it, or when you drop it, you notify or not via an SMP message. But we saw that it is also common that in some cases when you detect you don't want to fully drop, so you might want extra policies. So, for example, a rate limiting policy. So we propose that it is interesting to add also that you can, in addition to accepting to have an action in the forwarding behavior, to have another forwarding behavior that is limiting the rate. Okay, so for example, in this case, you could limit the rate to 20%. Okay, so next slide, and then we can have some time for discussion. Yeah, so here, so first is should we maintain this augmentation approach as we are having here, or we incorporate them into a base version of the ACL model. This augmentation, well, the structure is easier to parse, it's easier to do. But we need to do some, it's a little bit sometimes challenging when creating those augmentations, and sometimes we are finding some limitations. Okay? And sometimes, well, if you go to the BIS approach, we could be more clean, and even maybe some things could be fit together in the same structure instead of having to replicate structures. And the second question, I think it was related also to your comment that we had, is where to position the defined sets. Okay, so the defined sets, the thing is then they are references in the matches. Okay, so it has impact, especially if other modules import the packet fields module, for example, and they want to or they import, for example, the packet match in another place. Should it happen? I don't know if it happens in many places, but if someone imports it and it is referencing to the ACL, okay. So it could be standalone in a new model. So in a new module, just have a separate module for the prefix sets or for the sets, and you just reference them. And finally, question is, okay, this is the right place to work on it. The NetMod is ops. We didn't know which was the best place, but as ACL model was done here, we thought it was here. So
I'm going to start with the easy one. Which working group? You know, as you said, this is built on top of ACL, so it seems like the right place to do it. Kent isn't here, you know, for me to whisper again. So if he disagrees, he was the shepherd on that document. So of course, if he disagrees, I actually will defer to him. But to me, this seems like the right place. And in terms of BIS or augmentation, I think it goes more to what's going to be the common use. If the common use is you're going to be doing the full set, my personal preference, not as chair, but my personal preference would be BIS. If a common usage could be either, then I would go for the augmentation. Again, this is just my personal preference, trying to give people something to think about, to express their own. Mahesh, you're in queue, and I thought you might have been left over, but it looks like you want to say something.
Right. So Mahesh, Arcus Networks, as the original author of the ACL Yang model, I am glad to see that there's some work going on and trying to see where were some of the gaps that we missed in the first version. So absolutely, I'll let the work group decide whether they want to do it as an augmentation or a BIS. I'll let the work group decide that. Specifically, my question is actually a couple of slides back on the rate action. If we could go back, I think it's the slide before this. Yes, rate limit actions. I would suggest that this is not the right Yang model for a rate limit action. I would suggest that you look at the QoS Yang model, because the moment you put any kind of a rate limit, you also need to have some metering capability in the same module. It generally is not the case. So if you're looking for some kind of metering, look at the model. I think the QoS model already addresses this in terms of ability to drop packets when it exceeds a certain amount of rate. So that's one suggestion.
Joe?
Joe Clark, Cisco. Real quick on the last question. So I would say it would be nice to have this in a standalone container, because I can see, thinking of some implementations that might use this, there's other things I could see these groupings being used for, and besides just ACL. So I think it would make it easier to import into that other work.
Okay, so this has been talked about a couple of times now. The last time was a little bit ago, it wasn't the last meeting, but we thought it would be good to ask the same question we asked for the previous one. So same sort of guidelines. And, you know, for some, they may not be aware of the document, so this might be a hard ask. And, you know, we just like the previous one, it doesn't mean, no doesn't mean never, we won't discuss it again. But if you have an opinion, it'd be good to voice it. We'll just pause for a minute. Mahesh? And we're going to, just so you know, we have about a minute left before we have to move to the next.
Yeah, so this is more a response to Joe. I like the idea of grouping, but I notice you can have the grouping and still be part of the model where it can be used by other models by importing just the grouping, leaving the instance both in this model and in other models.
Okay, I'm going to close that session. I'll note that few people, you know, a small percentage of the people in the room participated, but everyone who participated was supportive of adopting. So I think this one, that's a pretty good indication that you're headed in the right direction. People are interested in this, but it's still new to them. So I'll talk with Kent afterwards, and we may see a poll. We may want to wait another meeting. It'll be based on offline discussion. Thank you. So now we're going to move to versioning.
Okay. Yeah, go to slide 2, please. Okay, so there's actually 3 parts to this presentation. So first I'll just be doing a bit of an overview because there's a set of 5 drafts we're working on related to Yang versioning work. Then I'm going to present on kind of the base fundamental draft, which is module versioning, and Joe's going to present on the Yang Semver draft. For anyone who just wants to ramp up again on what this work is fundamentally about, you can always flip to the last 4 slides of this presentation I'm presenting now, and it gives you a very quick overview of what the work is about with a few nice pictures and things. I'm not going to go over those today, though. Okay, next slide, please. So we're working on kind of a broad set of proposals to deal with some evolution in Yang versioning. There's 5 separate drafts. I'm not going to walk through all of these at the moment, but a big focus has been on number 1 and number 2 here to try to get those standardized now as quickly as we can. We've been seeing increased demand to wrap that work up, but we do plan on bringing all of this work to RFC in a phased manner. Okay, next slide. This is just for reference, so you have easy links to the drafts. Next slide. So a fair bit of this work is happening on a weekly call, Tuesday mornings. Everybody's welcome to join those at any time, and don't feel bad if you're not fully ramped up or not in the middle of the discussions. There's some people who just come and go occasionally. It's great to get other opinions on this work, so please feel free to join. It's important we get a big cross-section of people, and we're always really trying to especially get more users and operators in these meetings. It's pretty heavily vendor focused. It is a broad set of people though, so it's a good cross-section, but we can always use more opinions and more inputs on this work. There's a lot of kind of issues to try to decide. Currently it's every Tuesday morning at 9 Eastern, 2 UK time. And I send out minutes for that weekly with links to the meetings, so please feel free to join in. Next slide. Okay, so what have we done since last IETF? Time has kind of zipped by, and we're never quite getting as much done as we kind of originally hoped. But so a really big focus was something that was brought up on the list as part of the last working group, last call on this doc, and that was looking at kind of an alternative to our top level version and non-backwards compatible markings, and that was looking at per node markings. I don't know what happened to our lights here. Interesting. All right. I don't know if a spotlight's about to come on, but there's no dancing about to happen. All right. So we discussed this in a lot of detail. It pretty much, it was really the focus of all our time since the last meeting. So we have gone and defined these per node annotations. You can mark individual nodes as, okay, this one was non-backwards compatible in this release, etc. But we have decided not to include it as part of the base draft. So there's more details on that coming up in the next presentation, but it's not going to be part of the base draft, or at least that's our proposal. The second thing that really was a focus is there's quite a bit of feedback from the last call in these first 2 documents. A lot of issues raised, a lot of good discussions, a lot of gray zone decisions we had debate about in the weekly calls. We think we're pretty much done that now. Every issue was tracked in the GitHub. We kind of debated them all down to an answer amongst the weekly call group and authors, and we replied back to a list about pretty much every one of those. So we feel that that is pretty much done. We made some updates to the drafts, and we're going to, there's still a few updates left to go, but we think we've closed most of the process from the first working group last call. We really did not get to looking at schema comparison packages or version selection drafts since last IETF. Next slide. Okay, so next steps at the high level here are we want to finish the remaining updates to our first 2 drafts, module versioning and Yang Semver. There's a few issues still to wrap up, mainly about just trying to get the right text for them. So we've got a set of people helping out on our calls. Then the plan is to submit those two drafts to a second and what we're thinking is hopefully final working group last call. And the intention is to try to move those forward to RFC. So we're not going to wait for the last three drafts. We're going to try to drive forward to completion on these two. The work's been taking a long time to converge. I apologize, but trust me, there's a lot of hours that have gone into this. It's not because we're sitting around and not getting to it. ORAN specifically asked to have these two completed, and we've heard the same message informally from a lot of other people who are interested in this work. Then we'll phase work on the remaining documents after that, the schema comparison, packages, and version selection. And there's still a lot of work to be done on those as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we'll skip these. And Kent, if you don't mind, I'll go to the next deck, please. Okay, so now this presentation is just about the very first fundamental base draft of the versioning work called module versioning draft. Next slide. Okay, here's a little bit of a summary based on working group last call and some updated text. These are some of the changes we've made to the draft. So we released version 7. We reworked the introduction from some of the feedback. We included a summary of the 5 drafts right in the introduction there. It helps reduce dependency on the on another kind of overviewed informational draft that we had. So that's more contained just in this first draft. As part of the work where we created the per node backwards compatible tags, we renamed the top level one just to make it really clear that it's different. So it's that new top level tag is now called non-backwards compatible revision, just to be really explicit that it applies to the entire revision of the module. We removed the bullet in section 311, which is the list where we took 7950 and all the rules in 7950 about what is compatible and what's non-compatible, and we've made a very small number of updates to that. One of the updates was that we were originally going to allow reordering of Yang statements outside of input and output sections, but we decided against that in the end. So as part of this work, we're not going to open the door to reordering. We're going to keep reordering as a non-backwards compatible change as per 7950 everywhere. There's a number of places we made decisions like this where there's things we could kind of optimize and change, but overall, in the end, we've tried to kind of minimize them and just stick with most of 7950 other than try to fix really the big problems. There's lots of other little optimizations we could make to things that maybe are kind of backwards compatible, maybe we could allow in the future, but that was slowing down the work, wasn't critical, and it's something that could be rediscussed in the Yang 2.0 or future work. We also, as part of this kind of simplicity and getting the work done, we also decided that changes to import statements are going to be classified as backwards compatible. So if you change, for example, in an import, which version you're importing, the idea is we're not going to kind of carry through changes that might mean into the current module. We're just going to call that backwards compatible. So if different modules import each other, a server and client can know about changes by looking at each individual module and saying, has that module changed as the flag, the indicator that something in the data model has changed. We clarified some things around the file name format. So as many of you know, there's a current format kind of recommended in the guidelines that has the @ symbol and a date. Well, what we're saying is that if you're using labeling, we're recommending that instead you start using a hash and the label, okay, if the label is available. And then we also clarified some text on what it means to reduce the value set of a leaf. So we're a little more clear around that, saying that as long as all the values that were previously accepted are still accepted, then you're not reducing value space. So those are the main changes. We skip to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, a big part of the work we did since the last IETF was to fully invest in defining these per node compatibility indicators. We weren't sure 3 months ago for sure whether we were going to include these as part of module versioning or not, but we want to do the work to define them in either case. So we've gone through and defined them. There's basically 3 indicators and they're all optional. So the key is at the top level of the module, it's kind of mandatory if you've made a non-backwards compatible change somewhere in the module and you want to document that for the users of the module. So you have to mark the module overall, the revision as non-backwards compatible. Optionally, if you wish, you can mark what this work says is you can mark individual nodes saying, well, it was actually this node that changed. And you can keep a whole history if you would like right in the details of the API. There's pros and cons of that, but it is an optional marker. It's particularly useful when a tool or even a user might assume that a change would be classified in a different way than you might expect. So, for example, a pattern change is often very hard to interpret, depending how complex the pattern is, the regex. So this allows an author to say, I know this looks like a change, but you could tag it saying, this is actually backwards compatible. I've just reformulated my regex. Another use case is you might reduce a range in a configuration leaf, which normally is non-backwards compatible. But if you're, for example, a vendor and your implementation never accepted some of the values that you had in your range, you're just doing a bug fix to fix your module so it more correctly documents the constraints that always were there. So if you had a range 1 to 100, whoops, my implementation only accepts 1 to 50. The server never would have accepted the value 75. So you fix the module. Officially, that's a non-backwards compatible change, but you could mark it here, that specific one, no, that was backwards compatible. So there's a few use cases for this. But in the end, it is still, there's a number of reasons we don't want to include it in the base draft. So one thing is at the module level, the top level, we need that no matter what. It's kind of the fundamental marker just to indicate an NBC change has occurred. That's the one that has broad interest. We're already seeing it actually used in the industry with OpenConfig. I think some vendors are actually already kind of using proprietary versions of it. So we know that one is simple, well understood, and there's already has interest in adoption. The per node ones are useful. They are more complex. So you can look in the schema comparison draft for the text. Sounds very simple, but when you start looking at some corner cases of what happens when something's removed, it does get a little bit more complicated. So we really felt that is an optional extension to this work, not part of the base work. It also, the per node markers, we definitely found fit better with the schema comparison discussions and the tooling topic. So we think there's a good fit there with the schema comparison draft. And we also felt that, at least within the weekly call group, we kind of like the idea that the body of the module is really just the API. It's not a whole bunch, it's not littered with a whole bunch of history of how the API has changed over time. It's just, here's my version 3 of the module. The body of it describes the API, and sometimes maybe it's better to leave all the history annotation to the top, separate. So those are some of the reasons we decided that we don't want to include it as part of the base module versioning draft. Okay, go on to the next slide. Okay, so what are the outstanding issues for this draft? We're really trying to drive this to completion. There is still one fairly significant one, and that is we're debating what to do with the revision or derived, the import by revision or derived. So we've got some comments on the list. We're looking at maybe making it less strict as a hint instead of a absolute strict rule. And I do have a slide on that in a moment. There's about a half dozen more minor updates required based on the working group, previous working group last call. We have the captured in GitHub issues, and we're just trying to fix the text for those. And I already talked about the third bullet, the per node compatibility extensions. Next slide. Okay, so softening of revision or derived. So we, as part of the module versioning work, we are trying to improve how imports are described. So a Yang module can import another Yang module. In 7950, you can do that by saying, I want to import a very specific version, but there's definitely been consensus in the working group that importing by specific version doesn't really work. It's too brittle, and as soon as you churn the imported module, you got to go find all the importing modules and go update those to say, oh, actually, I want the new version now. So it doesn't really work very well. So we've introduced this concept, which is, it's not perfect either, but it's what we believe is the best way forward to solve the kind of worst of the problems. And that is to allow a Yang module to say, hey, I want to import at least this version, okay? And it can be this version or anything after it, because I know at least I have the new definitions of this grouping, or I have a 6991 BIS, I need this new, whatever one of the new things that we're putting in the 6991 is. And you can say, I want that version onwards. Where we're struggling a little bit, and still a bit of an open issue, is how strict we want to be about that. So today the language in the draft is somewhat strict. It says you must import a version that is at least this version or is a descendant of it. We're looking at maybe softening that, and it's a little bit to do with trying to be more compatible with current tools and the way current tools will work, which allows more flexibility in what version is used. So if you don't specify a specific version, a tool or a client is allowed to kind of, it's a bit inconsistent in the standards right now. Some places say you have to grab the latest. Some say it's kind of undefined. So what we want to do is allow that to maintain, allow that behavior to be maintained. So it's more, we're looking at it to be a suggestion saying, hey, if this version or derived version is around, we'd recommend you pick it up. But if you don't have that version available to you, you're allowed to make a decision like the current 7950 rules allow you to make, as in pick up whatever arbitrary version is available or pick up the latest. Part of the thing we're scratching our heads about as well is when you have an import statement by version in a Yang module, how is that used? What users or tools actually use that? When you picture a server and a server advertises to you in Yang library, here's the modules and the versions I support. Well, those are the versions it supports. So if whatever the constraint says on the import statement, the server's telling you what it's supporting. So unless there's ambiguity in what the server is reporting, if the server is reporting multiple versions, which is only allowed for import-only modules, it's only allowed to implement one module, one version of a module. So, I mean, the client at that point knows what the server is telling it is to be used. So we're also in the middle of debating exactly how is this import by version used? Like what uses it? Especially given a server is going to advertise what versions it's using. So apologize if that isn't clear. We're still actually just trying to get our heads around what we should do on this one. And it's a little bit of a complex one. Any feedback here, if people have thoughts, is great. But also, please join the weekly calls if you have some ideas or thoughts around how this import should or could work. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. No, okay, so that's it for this presentation. I'm going to hand over to Joe then to talk about Yang Sember.
Thanks for keeping us up to date on where the document stands. Clearly, this is getting a lot of interest from the community and from users and implementers. If you haven't been tracking, it's a good time to go read the document. We are closing on just a few more issues and then expect to do a second last call. I look like Rob looks confused.
I sure hope not. Everyone, I'm Joe Clark. I'll be presenting Yang Simver, and I had to laugh because on Jason's slide it had capital S, capital V after Yang, and as you'll see in a minute, we were very prescriptive in how we write things, and it shouldn't have been with the capital V. Anyway, next slide, please. So what happened between last time and this time? We released a Rev 0.08, which finalizes the working group last call comments from way back when from Jürgen and Andy, or we hope we finalized it. Let me talk about that SEMVer thing. So in the draft, it talks about the SEMVer 2.0. And if you go to SEMVer 2.0.0, and if you go to semver.org, you will see that the way they write it is capital S, capital V. We wanted to disambiguate ourselves as much as possible. So this draft describes a revision labeling scheme that we call Yang SEMVer as a proper noun, and we define that in our terminology section. We differentiate between capital S, capital V SEMVer, the SEMVer 2.0.0, which we reference in that document. That said, there is a relationship between the two. We augment, so to speak, or we extend the base rules of SEMVer 2.0.0 with our own semantics, but our scheme can be backwards compatible, or if you do not use our modifiers that we have, you end up with something that obeys the SEMVer 2.0.0 rules. So we clarified some of that with additional text within the document. We also defined what is meant by an editorial change. There was some text in there already, but we kind of pulled it out and made it a little bit clearer. There was discussion in working group last call about when one should, as you're doing like pre-release, you're doing module or draft development with a Yang module in it, when should you, if you're going to use the Yang SEMVer rules, and we think as the people on the call that we should push for Yang SEMVer to be used as a revision label scheme for IETF modules. So when you're doing that IETF module development, when do you have to bump that SEMVer or the revision label? So we clarified when that happens. And in fact, because we did make some changes to the Yang module that's in this document, this is a time where we did bump that. So the current revision label for the module within this document now does match 08. And then there were some IDNet problems, some long lines and whatnot. So we got things kind of tidy for that second working group last call. Next slide, please. One of the things that came up, both in working group last call, there's been some discussion about it, and we kind of raised it. I don't remember who first raised it on the Tuesday call, was what about these things that might be considered bad trees or bad version lineages? We might need additional text to cover what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So some of the things that have been said on list and that we've talked about, and Jason mentioned this whole idea of lineage in his presentation, that the revision label is kind of like an alias. It's a reference. It says, given this revision label, it points to a revision. And once we know the revision, we can work our way up and we can find where our current module, where it descended from, who was its parent or grandparent, so on and so forth. And that's all well and good. I have the alias, I can find my revision, I can work my way back in the history, and I know whether or not I was derived from this other module. But there are implied rules with SEMVer that the human brain just latches onto that says that if I have something that is 3.5. 3.2, let's say, and I have something that's 3.5.1, or let's do something better. If I have something that's 3.7 and I have something that's 3.6, I might assume that 3.7 is backwards compatible with 3.6, just because that's how my brain thinks about SemVer. But what we realized was there was no text in the document that really said that that was the case, that we wanted 3.7 to be backwards compatible with 3.6. So we started to explore what is, starting on the next slide, please. What are good and bad lineages, or good and bad trees? So here is the bad tree, and this is the text that we added around this. I'm not going to read the whole text there. It's up on the slide. It's in the draft. But let's say you had a 3.5.0 and you went and added a 3.6.0 where you added a leaf called foo to 3.6.0. But then you decided to create a 3.20.0 later on, and you added a leaf bar, but instead of descending from 3.6.0, you descended again from 3.5.0. Well, if you just look at this from the whole, a Yang SemVer is a revision label, which is an alias to a revision. You would look up the revision and you could find that 3.20 did in fact not descend from 3.6. Great. So it obeys Yang versioning, what Jason described. But from a Yang SemVer standpoint, this is kind of weird, right? You would assume that 3.20.0 and 3.6.0 would have a relationship, that there would be some backwards compatibility there. But if you were a user of leaf foo and you went to 3.20.0 assuming that, well, it's just a minor revision, leaf foo should be there, you might be surprised that it's not, and that there is no backwards compatibility. This type of revision, this type of changes from a revision standpoint is perfectly legal. We're not saying that it isn't. The text that we added, however, says that if you're going to do something like this, you can't use Yang SemVer as a revision label scheme. Yang SemVer has some additional implications that says you need to follow those rules. The human brain should look at this and say, yep, 3.20.0, naturally, it's backwards compatible with 3.6.0. So in this case, I wouldn't be able to use Yang SemVer if this is the kind of branching that I have. Not supported in this revision label scheme. Next slide, please. This naturally precipitated other questions. So are these, so Jason brought up, because he does this, everything seems like, okay, we've got it where we need it to be. He's like, well, what about this? So what about these other trees? Are they allowed? In this case, in the A1 case, we have a 3.5.0 and we moved to a 3.51 compatible, and we did that because it was an editorial or patch change where we added a leaf foo. So we have to use our modifier compatible, and later on we added a 3.20.0 that added leaf bar. In this case, we think, yes, this is allowed because as you read the text with those modifiers, compatible, not compatible, all bets are off when you start adding compatible. When you start adding those modifiers, all bets are off. And we think this is more of a corner case because we think in general, a lot of the development would not necessarily use the modifiers. And then he created an A2, which is like A1, but with additional qualification for time. But still, we think that both A1 and A1 prime or A2, those would be allowed. Next slide, please. So A3, is this allowed? So in this case, we have a patch or editorial change, 2.3.5, and we created a new 2.3.6. Maybe we fixed the spelling of the word registered, which I did in our draft because I forgot an E. And then later on, we create a 2.3.20, again, a patch revision or editorial descendant from 2.3.5. We think this is also legal because in this case, there is backwards compatibility because of the definition of what those patch without a modifier, what those patch revision changes mean. Anyone using 2.3.20 will not be surprised if that E is somehow missing from a description. Next slide, please. Oh God, I love this one. A4. This one is actually generating some more discussion on list. I think Rob has some opinions on this. It's an A, so there are some of us who think this is an allowed thing, but really what's happening here is you're in time you're creating this 10 major revision 10 that goes to major revision 11, and then you have a new major revision 20, which descends from 10, not 11, and then a 30 from 20. I think this is allowed personally because once you get to major revision changes, we document, the human brain thinks, here comes Rob to tell me I'm wrong, that these are not backwards compatible. 10 and 11 aren't backwards compatible. 20 and 11 aren't backwards compatible. 20 and 10 aren't backwards compatible. And there are other development things that we feel would fit into this. So I think the consensus is this is an allowed tree. But Rob, please.
Rob Watson Cisco as a contributor to this work. So I think this probably is allowed. I think it's sort of against, in my mind, against the spirit of what SEMVA tries to achieve, which is you're trying to always update the head of the main development branch, and that's where you update the number. So, so I don't think we should disallow this. It just feels to me, I would sort of suggest people shouldn't, not in the documents they shouldn't do this. I don't feel that if I was implementing, I would steer people away from doing this, but I don't think it should be disallowed. But actually, I'd like to back a slide though, please.
Back a slide, please.
So this one, though, I do have more concerns with. I don't think this should be allowed because the 2.3.20 also should be backwards compatible to 2.3.6. So depending on what changes have gone into that, maybe if it's a patch change, maybe it's nothing significant and it doesn't matter. I don't know. But again, back to the same things with SEMVA. I expect these things always sort of mainly adding to the head of the branch, and we have the sort of non-compatible and compatible extensions to try and have that limited branching. But I do also admit that SEMVA itself is not brilliantly specified as to exactly what the rules are, which doesn't really help. But we can be tighter.
This isn't a hill I'm willing to die on. I agree with you. And I think if in software where this might be a bug fix, like, hey, I fixed this off by one error or pointer arithmetic problem, I would agree with you. So, but Jason, you're in the queue.
Yeah. So for this one here, I'm on the fence and don't care too much either. But one thing to point out is I think this one probably is okay, because don't forget the minor digit hasn't changed here. So they're still compatible. It's only editorial fixes that are the difference between these. So I don't know if we want to restrict this and say it's not allowed, versus the other variant of this that Joe started the presentation with, where the minor digit changes, it can actually cause compatibility problems.
Rob, yeah, I think for me, the thing that I'm thinking about the whole thing is the level of complexity that we have and that we're introducing, and where we can try and minimize that complexity. I think that is worth it. Even if we potentially disallow some of these cases, it feels to me that we should be trying to drive complexity down, because otherwise I think people are going to struggle to understand what the rules are. We should try and simplify it. There might be a few things we rule out, but that's okay. That's the right compromise to make.
So I agree with you. I'm wondering though, are you saying we should or should not add text either direction on this? Or we just have something that says, I don't even know if I want to add anything that says you should obey the rules of SEMVA. What are you suggesting might
I need to check the document again. I thought actually there was enough text already in here that says this is the rules of how you move along, and this is Jason's giving an indication he thinks more clarity might be required. But I think I can check the document again offline to see, but I'm not sure I need more text or text change. I'm just saying in terms of this, if somebody that I like, well, that's not great.
I think the problem is when we say we don't want this, or especially A4, I don't know if you had a slide after A4 that showed the alternative. If you don't support A4, and if someone needs to describe this branching scenario, the alternative for what they put may look worse. So that's something we should consider when we're, because it's not just don't do this, it's okay. And I think I showed an alternative to this A4 in the email thread that shows how you would do it if you don't do it this way. And I think it's a lot worse. So we should talk about what it means to drive complexity out. It may actually be harder to use if we don't allow this. So,
and to be clear, I'm not trying to say the document should specify you can't do this. I think it's more, it shouldn't encourage it. So it should be maybe left ambiguous. That's horrible. But
Ahmed.
Right. So Ahmed Al-Hassani with Swisscom. I have a bit more fundamental question here. So here, this is the reflection of the development history of the version, right?
Mhm.
This is not about the versioning itself. What Semver telling you clearly, if you have major upgrade, major revision, you have a new version, and they're not backward compatible. So whether I don't understand what's the point here to keep track of the history if you have anyway non-compatible versions. You can do for version 20, you can do the diff against 10 or 11. It doesn't matter. So
Right.
this is the nature development history, which
Mhm.
should be different than a software that deciding whether I can understand this version and operate on it or not.
Yeah, the fundamental reason for Semver here or having this as a revision label scheme is to give that consumer, the user, a hint to say, okay, now I downloaded, or this device is now supporting this version of the module. Oh, I'm currently using 10, and now this device wants to use 20. I need to do more work because this is likely going to impact the way the tooling that I have and how that tooling interacts with this device.
Exactly, but they
Yeah.
can do the diff against 10 or 20 or 11 in this case. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is like the history
Yes.
of the software, which is complicated.
Right.
And we try to codify it, which is probably hard.
I totally agree. I think we would allow, this might be the not the best development practice to do, but we should not limit ourselves. The user's still going to get what they want out of it. Next slide, please. Looks like I've got a few more left. I don't think I have your alternative. Now I move into illegal, bad trees. Tried not to use the word illegal in the draft. I don't think I did. But X1 is, here you have major versions, 20 or 2 to 4 to 6, and then descendant off of 2, you have 3 and 5. This is one where I kind of disagree with the college. They say illegal or bad, not allowed. I say it's major versions, so it's, to Ahmed's point, major versions. I'm still going to assume non-backwards compatible anyway. And to Rob's point, I would rather not add more example text of what's illegal. I think the one case we called out where your brain assumes backwards compatibility and it's not there, that makes sense to call out. Here, maybe bad development practice, but I don't think it's necessarily something we need to call out, which is why I have the question mark. The question marks here are, do we need to add text for either allowing or disallowing these things? Next slide, please. Oh, Kent.
Kent as a contributor. I think so, as others have said, I think it's technically okay for these kinds of trees. I agree it's bad form and probably wouldn't occur in practice, but technically it should be allowed.
Thanks. Next slide, please, while I've got you. Okay, another illegal tree. Again, I think okay. If you want to go from 2.0 to 10.0 back to 8.0, maybe you're caught in a reverse causal loop. I don't know. But it's not the best practice, but because it's major version numbers, I don't want to add, I wouldn't, my preference would be not to add text to disallow this. It just feels like it's bad practice, but Rob's clicking, so maybe he's joining the queue. Oh, Kent is, and Rob is as well. Kent.
Yes, Kent is a contributor again. I beat Rob by a click. I think this should be not allowed because software is going to want to do comparisons, integer comparisons, what's greater than less than. I don't know how software would be able to reason through this if we if we don't enforce monotonically increasing numbers. Or okay, sorry, take back the word monotonically. Just simply use increasing numbers.
Rob, as a participant, I agree with Kent. I'm not sure we need text to disallow this, but don't do this.
Yeah,
so
don't do this. I
nobody
agree.
should do this. If somebody comes and does this, well, that's their choice effectively. But I don't think the document needs to say don't do it. I think it should be obvious to me.
Yes. I can't imagine why one would. Okay, next slide, please. And this one is, again, an interesting one because we're using modifiers now. And we say that 3.5.1 compatible, which means that something was added. Let's say leaf foo was added to 3.5.1 compatible. And then we created a 3.5.2 compatible descendant from 3.5.0, which adds leaf bar, let's say. So 3.5.2 compatible is not backwards compatible with 3.5.1 compatible. In a human's brain, that might be counterintuitive, but with these modifiers, bets are off. We document that these are sticky and they it's to support that wacky set of branching. So here I'm conflicted whether or not we need to add text, whether or not this should be allowed. I would say don't do this, just like we've said on some of the other X's, but I don't know if we need to call this out as a counterexample or something not to do, or that we would not allow with Yang Simba. Might as well just build a house at that mic, Rob.
Rob Wilson as a participant, same answer as before. So don't do this, I think, but I don't think you need text for it.
Thanks. And last slide, please.
Great.
Sorry, Jan.
Yeah, I'm part of the Tuesday groups quite often, but maybe the word compatible actually in this case is a bit of a problem where people may be led to believe that just by saying 351 compatible followed by 352 compatible, we are suggesting that something is compatible while it isn't. So, I mean, we could look for a different word. I hate to bring this up this time in the process, but maybe something else, branched or something like that. 351 branched, 352 branched doesn't quite as well suggest that they are compatible. Thank you.
It's something we went back and forth a lot on these modifiers, as you know, so maybe something to discuss. I don't know that we want to change it now, but it can certainly be brought up and bannered around on the list. Last slide, please, which is really a anticlimactic. We think the next steps are to conduct that second last call to really bring out the next round of comments. And we think, irrespective of what we've discussed here, it's ready for that. It passes all ID NITs and Yang validations for the most part. There's some pending Yang stuff, but we don't think there's any major substantive changes yet to come.
So we just went over two documents. We start out by saying we're going to try to last call both of them again and move them forward together. And you said this one's ready, but the prior one is not. So what do you want to do?
I think we have to bring them together. I would say that we bring them both together. I think we're ready on both.
Oh. Yeah, Jason here. I think our intention is to bring them together. It's just Semver's we converged on it a little bit faster than the other one.
So when they're both ready, authors, please send a message to the list.
Okay.
I think I heard you two disagree just now, but that's okay. Just be explicit on the list. We're ready to go.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, great. Thanks. I'm amazed that after all this time, we're like a minute ahead of schedule. So with that, we're going to go to the last slot. And I should say to the versioning team and all the authors, thank you so much for some excellent work. It's super important work, and we know it's really tough, and it's taken a lot of effort. So thank you.
Thanks. So I'm Nigel Davis, and thanks for the opportunity to present this. I'm going to look at modeling and some challenges we've had in certain areas of modeling and suggestions, and I'm going to suggest that we may need to extend meta models, extend techniques and methodologies and so on. So that's what I'm aiming for here. I'll go to the first, if you go to the first slide, I'll move on one. Thanks. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, sorry.
It's being done remote. It's being done. Kent is remote. He's driving.
Okay, great stuff.
So we don't have to click here.
So I've got an idea and I put in, so there's the references in here. I'm going to go through this very briefly. Terminology is a challenge in this area, so we've come up with a new term which I'll talk about, which tries to help us discuss the thing. I've been grappling with this for a long time, and I keep running into the same problem. So a number of us agreed there's potentially an issue here, so we thought we'd present this. Next slide, thanks. So this gives us sort of an overview of where the challenge appears to lie. So as we look at advanced solutions, we come across a number of things: intent, capability, expression, where we're looking at the capability of the underlying devices and so on. Challenges, partial visibility, where there may be a noisy environment and we can't actually see the full view of the detector all the time, or something of this sort. So maybe I don't know the precise value. In policy, there's constraints present. So these are all constraint or range statement things. In a negotiation where I might start with a very vague expression of something and gradually narrow down to a point where I have a more precise expression. So these all appear to, as I said on the second bullet, all appear to be require some kind of development through a recursive or progressive narrowing of things. So with as I said, with negotiation, I start with a very vague expression of something and I gradually narrow down to a more precise one. There's no specific number of steps I might take here. So you might think of a process of meta model instance, but no, there's no number of specific steps we go through here. And I just stop at the right level for the viewpoint. So maybe I get right down to a set of very specific values. It maybe I get to just a set of constraints depending upon where I'm trying to aim, and then I stop, and that's my expression. So we coined this term occurrence because we couldn't find any other word. I've tried to use various other terms for this, but each one of these narrowings comes up with an occurrence of something. And the occurrence is a mixture always of statements of what look like specification of type with ranges and so on, and also statements of precise value. So the process we seem to be going through often is to tighten towards this instance, where even the instance may have expressions of range in it, because I'm dealing with an instance in a control plane environment where the device below is able to deal with a range input. So whereas in a normal instance statement, I might have a value as an integer where I see a single value, what actually might happen is instead of the single value, although it's an integer field, I want to be able to say I normally say between 7 and 9, and of course 8 is between, so I'll try harder, between 7 and 13 or something, where there's a range of possible values that integer can take. And I've got a little example of that. So, and if I look at this process, when I'm building a system, I assemble different occurrences, the same original thing, into an assembly, and I'll try and describe that in a few minutes as well. So if you go on to the next slide, actually, I'll end up running out of time on it. So just to re-emphasize, the modeling approach appears to be one of recursive narrowing that we seem to need to get to, where any model of the thing can be considered as being an occurrence at that level. Even if I get down to an instance, that's just an occurrence. So everything appears to be occurrences, and everything appears to be a progression towards this narrower and narrower thing. And the properties are defined in terms of constraints. Even a single value, the integer is 5, is still just a constraint on that integer. It's just a very, very, very tight one. And the method then requires an expression that mixes types and instance values together. And conventional modeling techniques don't appear to do this for us. So we then struggle inventing things in the middle somewhere. And hence the suggestion that there may be a methodology and a meta model requirement. But looking at Yang I played around in the back of the draft with in an appendix with some variant of Yang. It appears I could potentially use Yang if I, in a particular way to be able to do this. So it looks like Yang might be extensible to this, although the thing I do is very strange to do it. So if you go on the next slide, please, that'd be great. Thanks. So just to emphasize these things, so the things I was talking about, obviously intent, in the ID I use expectation intention because I like to look at intent as being a two-sided thing where the client expects and the provider intends to do something, but that's the desired outcome in terms of constraints. Capability is opportunity for behavior exhibited, which again is a set of constraints on a limited, bounded thing. And the partial visibility thing is I'm expressing that I can only see something within some kind of precise range. I can't tell you exactly what the temperature is. It's somewhere between 30 and 50, but I can't say precisely, or I might not know, or I might, be currently unsure, but eventually sure. So it narrows and broadens. If you go on to the next slide, please, that'd be great. Thanks. Thank you. So here's a sort of an example of some narrowing. I start off with a standard where I'm expressing something as a constraint is boundless. It's an integer. It's a randomly chosen bit rate, for example. And then in a particular vendor solution, there's a specification for this where that vendor solution is able to operate between 10 and 100 gigs. Another same vendor, another solution they've got where there's a piece of hardware maybe constrained by pricing of technology is able to operate between 5 and 50 gigs. And then I have an application A where the requirement is between 10 and 50. So clearly both those things will work, but because I can see the subset of the specification, then at some particular point, 30, 50, some other specific time at some particular point, 50 gigs only. So these things are different statements of range on that particular property where I want to be able to express those ranges, the final one being in that list, single value. And then I might have some proof of concept where I convert it to an enumeration where I only have 3 particular values, and then a particular case within that proof of concept with only 1, and so on. And even the instance at the end there, the intent instance, because I'm applying this to some control plane, I've got a range of values, whereas the final one, it's an absolute value. You can do the next slide, please. So I'll skim this because I see I've only got just over 2 minutes left, but here I might, this is saying that when I'm assembling a system, I might have a set of what I might consider as classes, piece parts I'm going to assemble, but each particular application of those parts, a particular part is subtly different. Minimally, it's a different instance. So if I think about some memory, I'm building a memory chip, I've got the same cell repeated over and over and over again, but they're not identically placed clearly because then they'd be the same single cell, and they're not the same instance. So I've got this subtle variety across this set of same things. When I'm building a system, I seem to have to reuse parts, but where each part is subtly different from another usage, and that's that same level. And of course, I then may have this may be a module that I then install on another system, and again, I've got the same parts being reused with again subtle variety in them. The particular picture here is it's taken from some O&F work we're doing where we're looking at defining a management hierarchy and talking about view mappings and so on. But it shows there we find it in all of the other specs of system assemblies we're trying to do. And clearly they're not instances because it's not a real running thing. Can you go to the next slide, please? Great. Thanks. And this just the work we're looking at seems to overlap severely with the compatibility and also versioning. So I think it plays well into what you're doing in that area. I'm not going to describe this slide. It's describe the actual descriptions in the ID, but I see I've got almost no time left, so I'll allow for questions. So I'll go on to the next slide, which I think is the final one too. So what we were looking at here. It seems there isn't any readily available terminology to deal with the notion of occurrence other than this word we've now used ourselves. But it may be that there is, and so hence I'm looking across I presented this on the NMRG yesterday again, and we're looking for assistance to identify an existing set of techniques or terminology that might fit with us. I'll take the question at the end if you don't mind. So improving terminology, trying to home in on other areas where this has been determined and used. It seems to be no good language to describe this. So as I said, maybe we can take Yang and refine it in certain areas to help us do this, solve this particular problem. And hence bringing this here, maybe we could work together to evolve Yang to be able to deal more with these specifications and these definitions of intent where we have this sort of constraint problem. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. I see one question.
Rob Wilson, Cisco, no hats on. So thank you for bringing this work here. I think it's really interesting what you're doing here. So it's interesting. I do wonder. I'm not sure I found the example use case to you that compelling in terms of why you wouldn't just use a min and max for those two values and seem to solve that one. So I'm struggling to see.
It was severely simplified to allow me to describe it during the presentation slot of 10 minutes, unfortunately. So that's all I had to, and I thought bringing a very simple example might just give the idea of the range, and that's all. But you're right, it's actually a lot deeper than this and a lot more challenging in many areas where I've got interrelated properties, which I want to be able to describe the interrelationship as I narrow them. They don't just simply narrow. I mean, the example I've seen, which is probably a simple one again, is temperature humidity behavior, where the humidity, acceptable humidity varies with temperature. And so as you sort of get an area described. So although temperature and humidity are initially defined as individual isolated values, and they seem to be independent and have nice big broad ranges, and in any particular application, they don't play separately, they play together. And I want to be able to describe that sort of restriction. So you can actually...
So even that within Yang, you can use like a grouping to tie those things together. So I think it's a question whether you're trying to model a given value in the tree as having this range, or whether you expose those ranges. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's the sort of because I think trying to explain more the exact problems you're trying to solve would be helpful for the working groups to understand. Is this too complex? Is it out of scope or not? And I've lost my other suggestions I was going to say anyway. So
okay, that's great. Nice, thanks. Yeah, I can work through more. There's a few more things in the idea, and I can work through some more myself, obviously, in the follow-up of that as well. Thanks for the guidance.
Benoit Claes, and I'm going to be very quick because I see in your eyes that you have to cut the line. So thanks, Angel, for bringing this work. This has been on my mind for quite some time. I see those problems from multiple angles, from intent, from config, from operational data. There is no perfect answer, but we need to continue working on this because I see all of these problems. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting work. Look forward to hearing more as it matures. Definitely interesting. With that, we're actually a few minutes over time, and thank you all for participating in I think, a very good session, and look forward to seeing you the rest of the week. And thank you all to those who participated remotely.